immediately go to, but that's something that Jesus refers to in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation. Complicated is usually the one of the first things. First things I think of is the 7 churches of Asia, but the second thing I think of is complicated. If I hadn't, if the 7 churches of Asia didn't fascinate me so much, it would probably be complicated. It does. It is kind of complicated. So I don't know if we're going to continue on past the churches of Revelation. I haven't decided yet, just because it is complicated. Yes?
And then at the end, the description of heaven.
That's true. That's a little less complicated. But it's designed to give us hope. Yes?
I had in mind, we did a study years ago, but at the top I have a picture with the truth itself.
Yeah? Yep.
In a dream, it's very complicated to me, but I did write that in.
Truth to tell in a dream.
For what you want.
Yeah. Well, I am thinking about continuing, but instead of just doing like a verse by verse of every single chapter and all these different visions, and I'm thinking of doing a couple of things. And one of the things that I was thinking about doing is just doing a summation of maybe in a parallel, side-by-side parallel of maybe 2 or 3 different opinions on each of these visions. And doing a summary version, so that way we're not bogged down in a ton of details that you have to remember, but we can take a look at these 3 and maybe see if one of them makes sense and when we compare it to the light of present-day circumstances. And my opinion is that if it doesn't make sense, then it probably hasn't already happened yet. So if we go through some of these visions, you're going to see, even if you have 2 or 3 different opinions, you're going to see one of them that, wow, this appears like this might have already happened. It is very clear that we could put this up against the backdrop of history and we could say, all right, that's what this is talking about. But there are some where it's not so clear, and yet people have strong opinions, like this has already happened, but yet it's like, has it though? And so I think that's what I was thinking about doing, because it's easier to look at the summaries of those things and then compare it with the backdrop of history and present day and see whether or not it's occurred. And then you can get in debates all day long on, all right, since it hasn't occurred, what does this mean? But that's not what we would be here for. We would be here to, all right, Bible says something like this is going to happen. And to be honest, I think that's all we need to know. We overcomplicate things as humans, and I think part of it's because we have this desire to feel like we know everything. But I think Revelation was written for 2 reasons. One, it was written so that way we would be able to know, but it was also written so that way it would cover up our knowledge and it would confound our knowledge for things that we weren't supposed to know yet. Does that make sense? So it's designed for us to read and understand only those things that have happened. It's not necessarily designed for us to understand the things that have yet to come. I think that was, if that's the case, then, we could be uber prepared for things. And we're not supposed to be prepared for a specific date. We're supposed to act like Jesus could come at any time. Okay. Back to Revelations 2. In Revelation 1, we had beheld the risen, glorified Christ walking among the lampstands, which are the churches. Now in chapter 2, Jesus begins to speak directly to the 4 of them: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, and Thyatira. Each letter is not random or symbolic fiction. Okay, these were real congregations in real cities with real ministers or evangelists with specific struggles, pressures, temptations. And Christ's message to each of them is perfectly tailored to their specific situation. And we're going to see that. We're going to look at the history of what was going on, and we can see how his message was perfectly tailored to that specific church. And then we can look at how that applies today. That message still rings true today. And each message follows, to each church, follows a specific pattern. Christ identifies himself, and it's interesting how he identifies himself. And I was going to put this down, and I should have, instead of the fill in the blank. I forgot. I was going to change that and put this in there. What I wanted to do, and maybe you can just turn around your little page and write these things down, but if you could go through and make notes on each of these things, I think that would improve your study time. But there's a specific pattern. One, Christ identifies himself, and how he identifies himself can differ. He commends faithfulness. All right, he commends faithfulness. And then he rebukes sin or compromise. That's the third thing. And then he calls to repentance. That's the fourth one. And then he promises something, a reward to be faithful. Christ identifies himself. And when we get to each church, we'll go through this. He commends faithfulness. And in some of these churches, there might be two things that he commends. Okay? And there'll be something that he condemns. But in a couple of churches, there'll be no condemnation. And that's the third one. He rebukes sin or compromise. He has something that he condemns. Okay? So he commends faithfulness, he rebukes sin, and then a call to repentance. And then a promise. One of the key verses in every single book that we will, or every single letter to every single church, one of the key takeaways is that he's constantly stating, he that hath the ear, let him hear. Okay? In other words, this is extremely vital. This is extremely important. If you don't hear anything else that I'm saying here in this letter of Revelation, if you don't hear anything else, you need to hear these things. So whenever in the book of Revelation, in my opinion, okay, and this is my opinion, but in the book of Revelation, and I haven't done this. This is one of the things that I put down on a note to do. But how many times after the book of or after the letters to the churches does he say, "He who hath an ear, let him hear"? And my opinion is whenever he says that, this is something that we should be able to understand right now. This is something he wants us to hear right now. Okay? This is something that Jesus is saying is important for right now. So I think that's a key for us when we see those words and we read those words. He who hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. We need to perk up. We need to pay attention. These words remind us of something. They remind us that Christ still walks among his churches. And he's observing, he's correcting, and he's strengthening his people. So let's get into it. The letter of Ephesus. This could also be titled, and I stole this. I read so many commentaries, it's not even funny, yesterday. And so I saw this in one of my commentaries, I think it was the College Press, so I stole it because I liked it. And to be honest, I think it's a common thing. So, but it's the letter to Ephesus, the church that lost its first love. And that's the title of this particular letter to this church. The letter to Ephesus, the church that lost its first love. So let's look at Revelations 2, 1 through 7. 2, 1 through 7. And we'll start with Ollie, and you read, let's just read 2 verses, and then the next person read 2 verses, and then the next, and we'll end at verse 7.
To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, the one who walks among the 7 golden lampstands, says this: I know your deeds and your toil and perseverance, and that you cannot tolerate evil men, and you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not, and you found them to be false.
And you have perseverance and endured for my name's sake, and have not grown weary. But I have this against you: you have left your first love.
Consider how far you have fallen. Repent and do the things you did at first. If you do not repent, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place. But you have this in your favor: you hate the practices of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate.
The one who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. For the one who overcomes, I will grant to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God.
Okay. So before we get into this, we're going to look at a little historical and regional context, which I think is important. And then as we go through the verse by verse, and then we're going to briefly go over this pattern, just briefly, and then instead of going it through verse by verse, I'm going to pull out a couple of key verses for now. But it's very clear in some of these verses, the historical context does play a factor. But the history behind the scenes of Ephesus is Ephesus was a chief city of Roman Asia. All right, by that I mean that when Rome went into Asia and conquered all of Asia and conquered, well, at this time, yeah, I think by this time they'd conquered all of Asia. So when they went in there, one of the things that they did was they adopted, and this is something you need to remember because it plays a factor in the seven churches of Asia, in the letters of the seven churches, is that when Rome would go into these countries, these nations, they would adopt the gods of that country. And they would say, all right, we're going to take these gods and we're going to put them right next to our gods. Now, we have a God that's above all other gods. You know, they had their preeminent God. But we're going to say all these other gods are important. And so what happens is you go into Asia and you have all these other gods. Now, all of a sudden, you have twice as many gods. You have 3 times as many gods. Because Rome isn't just bringing their own. They're bringing all the gods that they got from conquered Greece. So you got all those gods now, too. So, I mean, you've got 20, 30 different gods. And you've got some of these temples being built. But one of the things that they would do as well is they would take one of the largest cities, one of the most important cities of each of their conquered territories, and they would build that city up even more with infrastructure and roads, Roman roads. Remember Marius's mules? It's a historical thing. If you don't, go Google it. But they would build roads to this city, and this city would become a major hub, and that's where the governor, the Roman governor, would reside. Ephesus is one of those cities. It was a booming seaport with a population of over 250,000 people. And you might not think that's a lot because of today, but in that time period, that's huge. That's not Roman huge, you know, but Rome was about 1 million people, okay? But this was still huge in the grand scheme of things. When farmers would say, let's go to Ephesus, they'd be like, let's go to the big city. Because to them, that was a big city. It was also famous for the Temple of Artemis, or in some people called it the Temple of Diana. All right, and the reason why this is so well known is that this is one of the 7 wonders of the world. All right, are you beginning to think of Ephesus a little different now? This was home to one of the 7 wonders of the world. And by this time, some of those 7 wonders were beginning to crumble. But the temple was still standing. Remember the gardens of Babylon was one of the 7 wonders? But this temple was more than just a worship center for God or goddess. This temple functioned as both a religious center and a major financial institution. It was also a bank. So think about that for a minute. So your largest religious center also acted as your bank. Okay? And you would have trade that would occur all around that temple and inside that temple. Remember when Jesus went inside the money, or went inside the synagogue and started to chase people out, the money changers? Okay? The Bible says there's nothing new under the sun. The money changers weren't doing something new. The money changers were doing something that was already done in foreign temples all across the world. Temples, religious centers, was where trade happened. And you would have money changers who would change out money, currency. So if you had somebody from Egypt that came and they needed to have the shekels of Greece because they were in Greece, they would go to the closest temple and they would change out that money. Okay? So this is where trade happened. This is where deals happened. And then they could go right outside to the agora or whatever, and a marketplace, and spend that money that they just changed out. This city was marked by commerce, by idolatry, and by immorality. The church at Ephesus was likely established by Paul on his second missionary journey. In Acts chapter 18, 19 through 21. We see that Paul comes to Ephesus, and he leaves Priscilla and Aquila there. We know that right before we went to Ephesus, he took a vow, had all of his hair cut off. And then he enters the synagogue in Ephesus, and he reasons with the Jews. So obviously no church was established yet because he went to the synagogue first. And that was Paul's modus operandi. When he went to a place to set up a church, the first thing he did was he would go into the synagogue and reason with the Jews. And he converted as many Jews as he could. Okay? So, That's when we think that the church was established. And then he strengthened it during his 3-year ministry, because he talks about in that same passage, he says, I'm going to come again. I'm going to come back. And he does. Paul comes back and he works with the church again, even more so. And it becomes a powerful center for evangelism throughout Asia Minor. In fact, later on, Timothy and possibly even John himself worked in Ephesus. And what gives us a hint that that might have occurred is 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3. He says, I thank God whom I serve with a... Whoop, nope, that's not it. Let's try one that does work. Okay, and 1 Timothy 1:3, and I urged you when I went into Macedonia, remain in Ephesus, that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine. Now, what's so cool about this, and this is Paul talking to Timothy, so obviously Timothy was in Ephesus working with the church there. So you guys are all familiar with the way things are. Somebody goes to Bible college, and during their summer months sometimes that young man that's studying to be a preacher is working with a church somewhere, right? Well, that's no different than what was happening with Timothy. Timothy had been taken under the wing of Barnabas and Paul and John, and he was working with the church in Ephesus, all right? And that's what he was doing. And Paul charged him to, told him to teach people, to charge them that they teach no other doctrine. Well, what do we see in our reading that they were doing? They were starting to be swayed by these Nicolaitans. And these Nicolaitans, which we'll talk about in another chapter, we might talk a little bit about it here, but they were all about subverting the doctrine and the gospel from within. And so that was something going on that Paul told Timothy he had to fight against. And we see Jesus is writing to them saying, yeah, this is a bad thing that they need to fix. So, description of Christ. The description of Christ is the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. That's the description. And then the commendation in verses 2 and 3. They labored diligently and tested false apostles. And you might think, well, if they did this, then how did they let the Nicolaitans come in? Keep in mind that at this point in time, they still hated the deeds of the Nicolaitans. Sorry, it's in the next chapter we're going to read a church that were allowing the Nicolaitans to come in. So Timothy actually did his job here. He strengthened them. They developed a habit of trying these false prophets, these false teachers. And then they endured hardships for Christ's name. So 2 different commendations here that Jesus had for them. But he had a rebuke, and that rebuke was that they had left their first love. And we'll look at what that is here in a minute. And so we're going to come back and talk about these things. And then another command, remember from where you have fallen, repent and do the works you did at first. And then the consequence, if not, I will remove your lampstand. And essentially it means I'm going to remove your influence. Because remember, Ephesus was a huge epicenter of commerce and trade. And the church had become a huge center, powerful center for evangelism. And so Jesus is saying, if you don't come back to your first love, I'm going to remove that influence. And then he promises to the one who conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is the paradise of God. All right. So we're going to start with verse 1. The words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand. We talked a little bit about what the 7 stars is last week. And that represents the evangelists. Some people think it represents heavenly messengers. I think it's quite clear that it does not. It's referring to the evangelists and the preachers of those 7 congregations. We see this again in verse 20 of chapter 1. We see this the first time. And then it says, Christ holds them in his right hand. And I thought this was very interesting because a lot of times we take a look at this, he holds them in his right hand and we think God's got us. All right, but that's not necessarily what Jesus is saying. That's not all that he's saying when he says he holds them in his right hand. He's also signifying that he has authority over them, that he has power over them, all right? Not just protection, all right? He's got them in his mighty right hand, okay? And so he is extending his protection over these evangelists, and these evangelists are under his authority, under his protection, under his direction. Does that make sense? Okay. The seven, and then I've often thought, and I still do believe, that the elders and the evangelists have somewhat of a simpatico relationship, where you have the evangelists who are to rebuke and reprove the elders and all patience, because it says reprove and rebuke everyone. It doesn't just say only those that sit in the pew and the elders are exempt. No, they're supposed to do this to everybody. And then, I read where elders are, to also guide the flock. It doesn't highlight, well, only those that sit in the pew. They don't need to guide the evangelist. So I've always thought it was a checks and balances between the evangelist and the elders. But I also think that the real way that God had things designed, we see it here clearly in 1st and 2nd Revelation, and the way that God had it designed was that the evangelist's authority was Jesus himself. And it was the people of the church, not just the elders, although the elders are supposed to drive it. I do believe that. But it was the church itself as a whole that was to test that evangelist to see if he was a false prophet. You get that? Did you notice that? The evangelist isn't supposed to have free run of the church. You shouldn't believe everything that an evangelist says. Otherwise, we would have all kinds of large mega churches, and Benny Hill would be up here preaching, not me. Okay? You'd have churches full of Jimmy Swaggarts preaching from the pulpit. I'm using those names. I don't know, you probably don't recognize them, but it's because I don't know of any of the new modern preachers. But the point is your church is supposed to test the evangelist to make sure he is not a false prophet. I say she because of the one lady with the book. What's her name? And she's a famous one. She has books, yeah. No, I don't. Was it? There we go. So, yeah, that's who I was thinking of, Joyce Myers. Yep, yeah. So we test these apostles. All right. So obviously the lampstands represent the 7 churches. So the application that we can get from this particular passage is that Christ is the only head of the church. The evangelist isn't the head of the church. The elders aren't the head of the church. Thankfully, nobody threw darts at me over that statement. Let's look at Ephesians 1, 22 and 23. Rebecca, if you want to read that. Ephesians 1, 22 and 23.
And he put all things in subjection under his feet, and made him head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills all in all.
Okay, we probably won't get through chapter 1. It might take us 2 weeks. We're not going to go through every verse, I promise, but we'll probably stop at this one because I got a couple of other verses I want to look up. But Christ is the only head of the church. Evangelists and elders serve under his authority, not above it. Okay? So every time the elders, and this is why I push, and I haven't done it recently, and I need to get back to it, and it's my fault, but this is why we push for elders and deacons in a church. And I'm not talking about the deacons that serve voluntarily. I'm talking about the office of a deacon. Because it's quite clear from other New Testament passages that the office of the deacon, what they did, what they were responsible for, and I will disagree with people, and it's fine. Again, we'll use Paul's thing that is, if it's going to cause a problem, then I have no such law, I have no such rule. But I'm one of those that believes that with this role of deacon, that there were females. Because that role of deacon had a very specific job. Their job was what you see here, everything that's been done, all the fixtures, everything else. The deacons decided that. The deacons had the budget. The deacons did everything that was responsible for running a church ministry, both internally and externally. They were responsible for helping fund what was going to happen outside of the church building. And then it was the elders that assigned them. And that's why I do believe that it was both male and female, because it was the elders that assigned them. We see this. We see this example. The elders said, you're going to do this. So the deacons were not doing things on their own authority. They were given the authority to go and collect tithes. They were given the authority to go to the widows and visit with them. They were given the authority to do all these different things. So they weren't usurping anybody's authority. They were given this directive by the elders. But what needs to be remembered is, again, evangelists and elders serve under his authority, not above it. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out was each local congregation is autonomous yet accountable to Christ. So each congregation was separate. Jesus didn't write to the bishop that's in charge of these 7 churches. He wrote to each church individually. Now, was there a bishop or an elder that was worthy of a double honor that was kind of involved in traveling to all of these different churches and encouraged them? Absolutely, we could prove that. It's quite clear from the letters that were written by those that sat at the feet of the apostles that at least one particular, and I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but at least one particular, his role was to go to all the churches throughout Antioch in that area, and he was exhorting them. He was working with their elders, working with their deacons. He was preaching. He was worthy of a double honor because he was kind of the patriarch of elders, so to speak. But that doesn't take away from the fact that each church was autonomous. And that's where I believe that slippery slope occurred, where you have Catholicism that comes in, and they take that role of this old wise man who was traveling around as an traveling evangelist elder, preaching and teaching. They took that role and they put him up on a pedestal and said, all right, now we have this bishop in a denominational aspect. And that's where it went wrong. Okay. Each church is autonomous, period, yet accountable to Christ. And any elder or evangelist that goes around preaching and teaching is still held accountable and should still be tested whether or not what they say is of God. And then evangelists. Evangelists are messengers. This is why, again, I hate the title pastor. Any preacher that insists on being called pastor, if they don't fit the qualifications of an elder, I think all they care about is the title. And I listen less to what they have to say. I really do. Because when I have conversations with some of these people, now I haven't had conversations with all of them, but the ones that I've had conversations with, their response to me when I talk to them about this is, and they already know what we're going to talk about, and they start poo-pooing it automatically right from the beginning. Oh, it's all right. It's not a big deal. We're talking semantics here. And they have absolutely no biblical response to the fact that elder means, pastor means elder. They have absolutely no response. And they'll say, well, it's just a word for today that's used to denote preacher. No, it's not. It is not. And words matter. All right? Evangelists, they were called evangelists at the beginning because an evangelist was somebody who brought a message. They were somebody who evangelized. That's what they were called. And they were called messengers for the longest time when the scriptures, or when the church or the kingdom was first formed, they were called messengers. And we need to understand these are not rulers over the flock. And I think we are done. It's 10:15. Man, I got preaching. We'll pick that up because there's a couple of verses in Timothy that we want to look at, and Peter. Any questions? Did it all make sense?